Don't give up.
Montana wind howled like a wounded animal that December night in 1876, carrying with it a blizzard so fierce it could freeze a man's blood in his veins. Jake Morgan, who folks called Wolf for his solitary ways and keen survival instincts, pressed forward through the white wall of snow, his horse struggling against drifts that reached its chest. He shouldn't have been out here. No sane man would venture into such a tempest, but the screams he'd heard carried on that wind weren't from any animal he knew. "Help me, please, someone!" The voice came again, desperate and female, cutting through the storm's roar like a knife through canvas. Jake pulled his collar, higher ice crystals forming on his beard as he squinted into the darkness. His lantern swung wildly in the gale, casting dancing shadows that made the world seem alive with phantoms. Then he saw it. An overturned wagon half buried in a snowbank, one wheel still spinning lazily in the wind. The horses were gone, probably dead or scattered to the four winds. But there, beneath the twisted canvas and splintered wood movement, a hand pale as the snow around it reaching out from the wreckage. Jake dismounted his boots, disappearing into the powder as he fought his way to the wagon. What he found there would haunt him for the rest of his days, though not in the way he expected. A young woman, her dark hair matted with blood from a gash on her temple, lay pinned beneath the wagon's bench seat. Her dress, once fine blue wool, was torn and soaked through, but it was her eyes that stopped him cold. Green as spring grass, they held a terror that went beyond the immediate danger of freezing to death. "Please," she whispered, her lips blue with cold. "My baby." That's when Jake noticed the gentle swell beneath her ruined dress. She was with child maybe 5 or 6 months along by his reckoning. The realization hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't just one life hanging in the balance, but two. "Ma'am, I'm going to get you out," Jake said, his voice steady despite the urgency coursing through him. "Can you tell me your name?" "Rose," she managed through chattering teeth. "Rose Winter." Jake worked frantically, using his rifle as a lever to lift the bench seat. The woman, Rose, cried out as the pressure released, and Jake saw her ankle was twisted at an unnatural angle. Broken most likely, but there was no time for gentle handling. The storm was worsening, and hypothermia would claim them all if they didn't find shelter soon. "I'm going to have to carry you," Jake said, already shrugging out of his heavy buffalo coat. He wrapped it around her, then lifted her as gently as he could manage. She weighed next to nothing, bird bones and baby, but the wind fought him for every step back to his horse. "Hold on tight," he commanded, settling her in front of him on the saddle. She slumped against his chest, her body trembling violently. "My ranch is 3 miles north. We'll make it." The journey back was a blur of white and cold, and the woman's labored breathing against his chest. Jake talked to keep her conscious, his voice a steady rumble over the storm. "You picked a hell of a night for traveling, Mrs. Winter. This storm's been building for days. Where were you headed?" "West," she murmured. "Away. Had to get away." "From what?" But she didn't answer, had perhaps lost consciousness. Jake urged his horse faster, knowing every minute counted. The animal, a sturdy Mustang he'd caught and broken himself, seemed to understand the urgency. It pushed through drifts that would have stopped a lesser mount guided by instinct, and Jake's iron will back toward home. When the lights of his ranch finally appeared through the storm, Jake felt a relief so profound it nearly unmanned him. He'd built the place with his own hands after the war, every log and stone a testament to his desire for solitude and peace. Now he was bringing chaos into his carefully ordered world, but what choice did he have? "We're here," he told the woman, though he wasn't sure she could hear him anymore. "You're safe now." But even as he carried her through his door and laid her on the rug before his fireplace, even as he built up the flames and began the delicate work of warming her without causing shock, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that safe was a relative term. The terror in those green eyes hadn't been from the storm alone. She was running from something or someone, and Jake had just put himself directly in its path. As he worked to save her life, carefully removing her frozen clothes and replacing them with warm, dry ones from his own wardrobe, he noticed things. Bruises on her arms older than the wagon accident, a pale line on her ring finger where a wedding band had recently been, and, most tellingly, the quality of her remaining belongings. This was no farmer's wife or saloon girl. Despite her current state, everything about her spoke of money and breeding. "What have you gotten yourself into?" "Wolf," he muttered to himself, using the nickname the locals had given him. A lone wolf who just brought home a wounded dove. The wind rattled the windows as if in answer, and somewhere in that howling darkness, Jake felt certain trouble was coming. Jake Wolf Morgan hadn't always been a man who preferred the company of cattle to people. There'd been a time before the war when he'd been quick to laugh, quicker to dance, and quickest of all to charm the ladies at the Saturday socials in Billings. But that man had died somewhere between Antietam and Appomattox, buried in a shallow grave alongside too many friends to count. The ranch he'd built in the shadow of the Rockies was his penance and his salvation. 500 acres of grassland and timber, purchased with his mustering out pay, and 3 years of breaking horses for the Army. He'd chosen this spot specifically for its isolation. The nearest neighbor was 8 miles east, the town of Cedar Ridge, 15 miles south. A man could go weeks without seeing another soul if he planned it right, and Jake usually did. He'd named the spread the Broken Arrow Ranch, not for any romantic notion of Indian fighting, but because he'd found a snapped crow arrowhead in the dirt the day he'd staked his claim. It seemed fitting. Everything here was broken in some way himself, most of all. The woman on his floor stirred, drawing him from his reverie. He'd managed to get her warm, her breathing now deep and regular, instead of the shallow gasps that had worried him earlier. The baby, as far as he could tell with his limited knowledge of such matters, seemed unharmed. Occasionally he could see movement beneath the blankets he'd piled on her, little shifts and kicks that suggested life persisting despite the ordeal. "Water," she whispered, her eyes fluttering open. Jake helped her sit up, supporting her against his shoulder as he held a cup to her lips. "Slow now. Too much too fast and you'll be sick." She drank carefully, her eyes never leaving his face. In the firelight, those green eyes seemed to hold depths he couldn't fathom. "You saved us," she said finally. "My baby and me." Anyone would have done the same. "No," she said with a certainty that surprised him. "They wouldn't have. Most would have ridden past, especially in that storm. Why didn't you?" Jake considered the question. Why hadn't he? Self-preservation should have kept him inside, tending his fire and waiting for better weather. "I heard you call," he said simply. "In the war, I learned to tell the difference between kinds of screaming. Yours wasn't fear of dying. It was fear of failing to live. There's a difference." Rose studied him with those penetrating eyes. "You were a soldier." "First Montana Cavalry. Rode with Custer before he got his fool self killed." Jake stood uncomfortable with the scrutiny. "You should rest. That ankle's broken clean through. I'll need to set it proper come morning." "I'm a burden to you," Rose said quietly. "I'm sorry for that." "You're a woman in need of help, nothing more." Jake moved to the window, watching the storm continue its assault on his domain. "Besides, I've got questions of my own. Like what a lady of obvious breeding is doing alone in Montana territory in December." Rose's silence stretched long enough that Jake turned to look at her. She was crying, silently, tears tracking down her pale cheeks. "I had no choice," she finally said. "He would have killed me, killed us both." "Who?" "The man who claims to be my husband, Marcus Thornton." Jake knew that name. Everyone in the territory knew that name. Marcus Thornton owned the largest cattle operation in 3 states, had judges in his pocket from here to Texas, and was rumored to have killed more men than cholera. If this woman was running from Marcus Thornton, she wasn't just in trouble. She was as good as dead. "You're his wife." Jake kept his voice carefully neutral. "Never his wife, though he tells everyone otherwise." Rose's hand went protectively to her belly. I was companion to his wife, Elizabeth. When she died of pneumonia last year, Marcus decided I would take her place. When I refused, she trailed off, but her meaning was clear. The baby. He forced himself on me, repeatedly said it was my duty to give him an heir since Elizabeth couldn't. Her voice was flat emotionless, the way Jake had heard men talk about battles too terrible to feel. When I became with child, he was overjoyed. Started planning the wedding, the announcement. That's when I knew I had to run. Why, if he wanted to marry you. Because I overheard him talking to his lawyer. The plan was to marry me, claim the child, then have me committed to an asylum for hysteria. Or perhaps I'd have an unfortunate accident in childbirth. Either way, he'd have his heir and his freedom. Jake felt a cold anger building in his chest, the kind he hadn't felt since the war. Men who hurt women were the lowest form of life in his opinion. Men who hurt pregnant women, they didn't deserve to be called men at all. How'd you get away? Marcus was in Cheyenne on business. I stole money from his safe-bought passage on a wagon train heading to Oregon. I thought I could disappear out there, start over. She laughed bitterly. The wagon master abandoned me 2 days ago when he learned who I was running from. Said I wasn't worth the trouble Thornton would bring. So you tried to continue alone. What choice did I have, stay and die, or risk the storm? Rose shifted, wincing as the movement jarred her ankle. I choose the storm. At least nature is honest in its cruelty. Jake returned to her side, kneeling to check the splint he'd fashioned from kindling and torn sheets. Well, you're here now. Thornton doesn't know where you are. He'll find me. He has men everywhere, rewards posted. Someone will have seen the wagon tracked it here. Maybe, but this storm will have covered any tracks, and it'll be days before anyone can get through these passes. Jake met her eyes steadily. That gives us time to figure something out. There's nothing to figure out. I can't stay here, can't put you in danger. Once I can travel, with a broken ankle and a baby coming, you wouldn't make it 10 miles. Jake shook his head. No, you're staying put until that ankle heals and that baby's born safe. After that, we'll see. You don't understand the kind of man Marcus is. He's killed people for less than helping me. I've known plenty of killers, ma'am. Hell, I am one if we're being honest about it. The war made sure of that. Jake's smile was grim. But I learned something in all that killing. There's a difference between a soldier and a murderer, between a man who fights for something and one who fights because he can. Marcus Thornton is the latter. I'm the former. And I don't abandon women and children to men like him. Rose was quiet for a long moment. I don't even know your name. Jake Morgan. This is my place, the Broken Arrow. Why do they call you Wolf? I heard someone shout it as we passed through that last settlement. Jake shrugged. I keep to myself mostly. Come into town once a month for supplies, don't socialize much. Folks think that makes me wild, untamed, like a wolf. Are you wild? No more than any other man who's seen too much and wants to be left alone to forget it. Rose studied him in the firelight, this scarred, weathered man who'd pulled her from certain death without thought for his own safety. He wasn't handsome in the conventional sense. His nose had been broken at least once. There was a scar running from his left temple to his jaw, and his hands were rough as sandpaper. But there was something solid about him, immovable as the mountains themselves. I'll bring trouble to your door, Mr. Morgan. Jake, and trouble's nothing new. Been dodging it since I was old enough to walk. He stood, joints popping. Now you need food. Baby needs it too. I'll heat some stew. As he worked at the stove, Rose watched him cataloging details. The way he favored his left leg, slightly probably an old wound. The careful precision of his movements, no wasted energy. The cabin itself sparse but clean, everything in its place. This was a man who'd learned to rely only on himself, to trust no one else with his survival. Tell me about before, she said suddenly. Before the war. Who were you then? Jake paused in his stirring considering. Different. My family had a farm in Ohio. Nothing special, just corn and hogs, but it was ours. I was the youngest of 3 boys, the one Ma said was born laughing. He resumed, stirring his voice distant. Had a girl, too. Mary Catherine O'Brien. Prettiest thing in Holmes County. We were going to be married when I got back. What happened to her? Married my brother Samuel. Can't say I blamed her. I came back a different man than the one who'd left. Couldn't stand the noise of the farm, the closeness of people. I'd wake up screaming, thinking I was back at Chancellorsville. He ladled stew into a bowl. Sam lost an arm at Gettysburg, but he came back, able to smile. I came back whole in body, but broken everywhere else. So you came west. Nothing left for me in Ohio. Out here, the space makes sense. The silence is a choice, not a symptom. He brought her the bowl, helping her sit up more fully. What about you? You speak like education, move like quality, even broken as you are. Rose accepted the spoon, her movements indeed graceful despite her injuries. Boston born and bred. My father was a banker, quite successful until he wasn't. Bad investments, they said, though I later learned Marcus Thornton had orchestrated his ruin. Father took his own life rather than face poverty. Mother followed within the year, they said from grief, but I think from shame. How'd you end up with Thornton's wife? Elizabeth was my mother's cousin. She took pity on me, offered me a position. I thought it was kindness. Rose's laugh was bitter. It was, but not the kind I'd hoped. Elizabeth was lonely, desperately so. Marcus married her for her connections back east, then promptly ignored her existence, except when he needed her to play hostess. She wanted a friend, a confidant. I needed a roof over my head. It seemed a fair trade. Until she died. Until Marcus killed her. At Jake's sharp look, Rose nodded. Oh, he was clever about it. Let her catch pneumonia, then prevented the doctor from treating her properly. Said it was God's will if she lived or died. She died, of course. Marcus had what he wanted from her, the connections, the respectability. A wife was just an inconvenience after that. The fire had burned low by the time Rose finished her stew, casting long shadows across the cabin walls. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault, but inside, a different kind of tension was building. Jake could feel it in the way Rose kept glancing at the door, as if expecting Marcus Thornton to burst through at any moment. You need to understand something, Jake said, settling into his chair across from her. If you're going to stay here even temporarily, I need to know what I'm really up against. Thornton's not just any enemy. So tell me about that night, the night you ran. Rose's hand went unconsciously to her belly, a protective gesture he'd noticed she made whenever Thornton's name was mentioned. It was 3 weeks ago. Marcus had gone to Cheyenne to meet with the railroad executives. He was pushing for a spur line through his property, would have made him even richer than he already was. She paused, gathering herself. Jake waited. He'd learned patience in the war, learned that sometimes the most important intelligence came from the silences between words. I'd been planning for months, Rose continued, saving little bits of money when I could, hiding supplies. But that night, I found something that changed everything. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Elizabeth's diary. She'd hidden it in the lining of her jewelry box. Marcus didn't know it existed. What did it say? Everything. How he'd poisoned his first wife back in Chicago. How he'd killed at least 3 men who'd opposed him in business deals, made them look like accidents or suicides. And Elizabeth. She knew he was going to kill her too. She'd been documenting everything, hoping someone would find it after she was gone. Jake felt his jaw tighten. Where's this diary now? Burned in the wagon, I suppose. I had it with me when... Rose's voice broke. All that evidence gone. Evidence only matters if there's someone willing to act on it. Out here, Thornton owns most of the law. I know. That's why I ran instead of trying to fight him legally. Rose shifted, wincing as the movement jarred her injured ankle. But there's something else. Something I haven't told anyone. Jake leaned forward instinctively, knowing this was important. The baby, Rose said quietly, might not be Marcus's. The words hung in the air like smoke. Jake kept his expression neutral, waiting. There was a man, a drifter, who worked the ranch for a few weeks. Charlie Hayworth. He was kind to me, the only person who'd shown me genuine kindness in months. Rose's eyes were distant, lost in memory. We only had one night together the night before Marcus came to my room for the first time. When I realized I was with child, I couldn't be sure. Does Thornton know? No. The timing was close enough that he never questioned it. But Charlie had blue eyes like summer sky. Marcus's eyes are brown as mud. She looked down at her belly. If this child comes out with blue eyes, Thornton will kill you both. It wasn't a question. Without hesitation, Jake stood and walked to the window, processing this information. The situation was even more dangerous than he'd thought. A wounded woman with a broken ankle was one thing. A pregnant woman running from Marcus Thornton was another, but a woman carrying a child that might prove she'd been unfaithful to the most dangerous man in the territory. That was a death sentence waiting to happen. What happened to Charlie? Dead. They found him trampled by horses a week after our night together. Marcus said it was an accident, that Charlie had been drunk and spooked the herd. Rose's voice was flat. Charlie didn't drink. More ghosts, Jake thought. Every person in this room was haunted by their dead. You want to know about my ghosts, don't you? Jake said, suddenly surprising himself. Fair's fair, I suppose. Rose looked up at him, those green eyes reflecting the firelight. First man I killed was at Shiloh. Jake began, his voice taking on the distant quality of memory. Boy, really? Couldn't have been more than 16. Confederate charge came at dawn, and suddenly he was there in front of me, bayonet aimed at my chest. I shot him point blank, watched the life leave his eyes. They were blue, like you said, like summer sky. He paused, lost in the memory. Thing is, he said something before he died, said, Mama. Just that one word. I carry that word with me every day. How many? Rose asked softly. How many men did I kill? Or how many deaths do I carry? Jake's smile was bitter. 2 different numbers. I killed 23 men that I'm certain of, probably more in the chaos of battle. But the deaths I carry my whole unit at Sailor's Creek. 32 men. I was supposed to be on watch that night, but I'd traded shifts with Tommy Morrison because he wanted to write a letter to his sweetheart. Jake's hands clenched and unclenched rhythmically. Confederate cavalry hit us just before dawn. Tommy died first, throat cut, before he could raise an alarm. If I'd been where I was supposed to be, maybe I could have warned them. Maybe some of them would have made it. You can't know that. No, but I can know that I survived because I wasn't where duty demanded I be. And that's a special kind of hell, Mrs. Winter. Rose, she corrected softly. Just Rose. Rose. Jake tested the name, found it fit. Point is, we're all carrying our dead. Question is whether we let them bury us too, or whether we find a way to live despite them. Is that what you've done? Found a way to live. Jake gestured around the sparse cabin. I've found a way to exist. Living. That's something I gave up claim to years ago. That's not true, Rose said with surprising firmness. A man who's just existing doesn't risk his life to save strangers in a blizzard, doesn't offer shelter to a woman who brings nothing but trouble to his door. Maybe I just recognized a fellow ghost when I saw one. They sat in silence for a moment, the wind howling outside like the voices of all their dead combined. I dream about them, Rose said suddenly. Elizabeth mostly. She begged me to help her at the end. Marcus had locked her in her room, said it was to keep the sickness from spreading. But I knew better. He was making sure she'd die. Why didn't you help her? Because I was a coward. Because I was afraid he'd kill me too. Because I told myself there was nothing I could do. Tears ran down her face freely now. But there's always something you can do, isn't there? Even if it's just holding someone's hand while they die. Jake moved to her side, offering his handkerchief. We all have our moments of cowardice. God knows I have enough of them. Tell me about Mary Catherine, Rose said, seemingly desperate to shift focus from her own guilt. Your girl back in Ohio. Jake settled back in his chair, allowing the change of subject. Not much to tell that I haven't already. Pretty as a picture, sweet as honey. Everything a young fool could want in a wife. Did you love her? I thought I did. But looking back, I think I loved the idea of her more than the reality. She represented everything clean and good and normal. Coming home to her meant the war would really be over, that I could go back to being who I was before. But you couldn't. No one can. War changes you at a fundamental level. It's like trying to unbake bread, turn it back into flour and water. Can't be done. Jake stared into the dying fire. She knew it too. Saw it in my eyes the first time I came home on leave. She tried. I'll give her that. But you can't love a ghost, and that's what I'd become. You're not a ghost, Rose said firmly. You're the most real person I've met in years. Marcus, his associates, even Elizabeth in her way. They were all playing parts. The cattle baron, the society wife, the business partners. But you're exactly what you appear to be. And what's that? A decent man trying to make sense of an indecent world. Jake laughed short and sharp. Decent men don't survive what I survived. Don't do what I've done. Maybe that's exactly why they do survive, to balance the scales a bit. Before Jake could respond, Rose gasped, her hand flying to her belly. What is it? Jake was beside her instantly. The baby. It's moving so much. More than usual. Her face was tight with discomfort. Something's wrong. Jake helped her lie back, his hands hovering uncertainly. What do you need? What can I do? I don't know. This is my first. Panic crept into her voice. Breathe. Jake commanded, his battlefield training taking over. In crisis, panic was the enemy. Deep breaths. The baby's probably just responding to stress. You've been through hell today. He grabbed a clean cloth, dampened it with cool water, and placed it on her forehead. Tell me about Boston. What was your favorite place there? What? Rose looked at him in confusion. Distraction helps. Trust me, I've had plenty of experience with pain. Tell me about Boston. Rose closed her eyes, focusing on breathing deeply. There was a park. The Common. In spring, the trees would bloom, and you could almost forget you were in a city. I used to walk there with my governess when I was little. What kind of trees? Jake kept his voice calm, soothing, even as he watched her belly ripple with movement. Cherry trees, pink and white blossoms. They'd fall like snow when the wind blew. Her breathing was evening out. Father would sometimes meet us there for lunch, before everything went wrong, before the debts and the shame and... Just think about the trees, Jake said softly. Pink and white petals falling. Gradually the tension eased from her face. The violent movements under her dress settled into gentler shifts. Better. Rose nodded, exhausted. Thank you. I was so frightened. Baby's been through a lot today, too. Probably just letting you know it's still fighting. Like its mother, Rose said with a weak smile. And that's a good thing. This child's going to need to be a fighter given what's coming. Rose's smile faded. You think Marcus will find us? I think Marcus Thornton didn't get where he is by letting people escape him. But I also think he's never had to hunt someone under my protection before. Jake, you don't owe me anything. When this storm passes, I should go. Find somewhere with a broken ankle and a baby that could come any time. No, you're staying put. His tone brooked no argument. The storm broke on the third day, leaving behind a world transformed. Snow lay thick as a man's waist across the valley, turning Jake's familiar landscape into something alien and pristine. He stood on the porch, breathing in the sharp, clean air, watching the sun break through the remaining clouds like a promise of redemption. Inside, Rose was attempting to stand for the first time since he'd set her ankle. He'd fashioned a crude crutch from a sturdy branch, padding the top with strips of cloth. She leaned heavily on it, her face pale with effort, but determined. You should rest that foot longer, Jake said, coming back inside and stomping snow from his boots. I've been lying down for 3 days. I need to move. Need to feel like I'm not completely helpless." She took a tentative step, wobbling slightly. Jake moved instinctively to steady her, his hand at her elbow. "Careful now. Last thing we need is you falling and hurting something else." Rose looked up at him, and for a moment, something passed between them. An awareness that hadn't been there before, or perhaps had been there all along, but buried under the immediate crisis of survival. Jake was acutely conscious of his hand on her arm, of the way her hair caught the morning light streaming through the window. He let go and stepped back. "I need to check on the livestock. Lost some chickens in the storm, but the horses and cattle seem to have weathered it in the barn." "Jake, wait." Rose's voice stopped him at the door. "I need to tell you something about what happened yesterday when I thought something was wrong with the baby." He turned back, waiting. "I wasn't entirely truthful. The baby was moving normally. But I panicked. Being here, feeling safe for the first time in months, it made me realize how much danger I'm still in, how much danger I'm putting you in." She struggled with the words. "I thought if I seemed more fragile, more in need, you wouldn't send me away." Jake studied her for a long moment. "You think I'd throw out a pregnant woman with a broken ankle? I think you're a practical man who didn't ask for any of this trouble." "No, I didn't ask for it," Jake agreed. "But it found me anyway, and maybe that means something." "What do you mean?" Jake removed his hat, running a hand through his hair. "I've been hiding out here for 5 years, Rose, telling myself I was healing, finding peace. But really, I was just slowly dying, just taking longer about it than if I'd eaten a bullet." The harsh words made Rose flinch, but Jake continued. "Then you show up bringing all your ghosts and troubles, and for the first time in years, I feel awake. Like there might be a purpose to my still being here beyond just existing." "That's a lot of weight to put on a stranger," Rose said softly. "Maybe. Or maybe sometimes strangers are exactly what we need. People who don't know who we used to be, only who we are right now." Rose hobbled closer to him, each step careful and measured. "And who are you right now, Jake Morgan?" "A man with a choice to make," he said simply. "I can send you on your way. Once you're healed, go back to my quiet life and probably live another 20 years in peaceful solitude. Or I can help you, really help you. Not just shelter you until the storm passes, but stand with you against whatever Thornton brings to our door." "Why would you do that? You don't even know me." "I know enough," Jake said. "I know you're brave enough to run when staying meant death. I know you're strong enough to carry a child alone into uncertainty. I know you're honest enough to admit your deceptions, even small ones. And I know what it's like to be haunted by choices you didn't really have." Rose's eyes filled with tears. "I can't ask you to fight my battles." "You're not asking. I'm offering." Jake replaced his hat. "Decision made. But if we're going to do this, we need to be smart about it. Thornton will come looking, and when he does, we need to be ready. How can we possibly be ready for a man like him by not being where he expects us to be?" Jake walked to his desk, pulling out a map of the territory. "There's an old mining claim about 15 miles north of here, up in the mountains. Abandoned now, but the cabin's still solid. We could relocate there until after the baby comes." "Hide. Strategic retreat," Jake corrected. "Give us time to figure out our next move without him breathing down our necks." Rose studied the map, tracing the mountain paths with one finger. "What about your ranch? You can't just abandon it." "I'll hire someone to watch the place. Frank Holloway owes me a favor from back when his son got caught rustling. I kept my mouth shut, and the boy got a second chance. Frank's a good man. He'll keep the ranch running. And after the baby comes, we can't hide forever." Jake was quiet for a moment. "There's another option, one that would give you and the baby legal protection." Rose looked up at him, confusion in her eyes. "Marriage." Jake said the word hanging between them like a challenge. "If you were married to me legally and properly, Thornton's claim on you becomes complicated. He'd have to prove his prior claim, and that would mean admitting to things he might not want public." Rose's hand went to her throat. "Marriage. But we barely know each other." "I'm not talking about a real marriage," Jake said quickly, though something in his chest tightened at his own words. Just a legal arrangement. Protection for you and the baby. Once Thornton backs off, we could dissolve it quietly. You'd do that, tie yourself to me and another man's child. Wouldn't be the first marriage of convenience out here in the territories. And as for the child, Jake's voice softened. That baby didn't ask for any of this. Deserves a chance at life without Thornton's shadow over it. Rose sank into the nearest chair, overwhelmed. I need to think. Of course, it's not a decision to make lightly. Jake headed for the door again. I'll see to the animals. Take your time. Outside, the cold air bit at his exposed skin, but Jake welcomed it. What had possessed him to suggest marriage? He'd come west to be alone, to never again be responsible for another soul. Yet here he was offering to bind himself to a woman and child who weren't his. But as he fed the horses and checked the cattle, he couldn't shake the image of Rose's face when he'd made the offer. Not grateful or calculating, but something else. Hope maybe, or recognition of something neither of them was ready to name. When he returned to the cabin at midday, he found Rose had managed to prepare a simple meal despite her injury. She'd set the table with his mismatched plates and even found an old tablecloth he'd forgotten he owned. You didn't need to do this, he said, suddenly aware of how domestic the scene was. I needed to feel useful, Rose replied, and we need to talk about your offer. Jake sat across from her, waiting. Before I can even consider it, you need to know everything, not just about Marcus, but about me, about the kind of person I really am. I know what kind of person you are. No, you don't. Rose's voice was firm. You know the victim, the woman running for her life, but I wasn't always that. Before Elizabeth died, before Marcus turned his attention to me, I was complicit in things, terrible things. Jake leaned back, giving her space to speak. Elizabeth wasn't just lonely, she was vindictive. She knew Marcus was unfaithful, knew about his mistresses in town. So she started taking revenge in small ways. A merchant who smiled too long at Marcus would find his contracts canceled. A woman who caught his eye might find her husband suddenly transferred away. Rose's hands clenched on the table. And I helped her. I carried the messages, spread the rumors, enacted her little schemes. You were dependent on her for survival. That's what I told myself. But the truth is, part of me enjoyed it. Enjoyed having power over these people who looked down on me as just a companion. I told myself they deserved it, that I was just evening the scales. She looked up at him, eyes bright with unshed tears. I ruined lives, Jake. Maybe not as dramatically as Marcus, but just as deliberately. Jake was quiet for a long moment, processing this confession. And now I know what it feels like to be on the other side of that power, to be the one whose life is being destroyed for someone else's pleasure. Rose's hand went to her belly. This child is my chance at redemption, maybe, to raise someone who won't make the choices I made. We all have things we'd do differently if we could, Jake said finally. The question is what we do going forward. If I married you even just on paper, you'd be tied to my past as well as my present. If anyone found out about the things I did, Rose, Jake interrupted. I offered to help you knowing Thornton wants you dead. You think I care about some petty schemes you ran for a bitter woman. You should care. It speaks to my character. It speaks to your survival. And to your honesty now. Jake stood pacing to the window. You could have hidden that part of your past. I never would have known. You deserved the truth before making such an offer. And now I have it. The offer stands. Rose struggled to her feet, hobbling over to join him at the window. Outside, the snow-covered landscape stretched endlessly beautiful and desolate. There's something else, she said quietly. Something that might change your mind. Jake waited. I think I could love you, given time. That's not fair to you, not when you're offering a business arrangement. Jake's breath caught. He hadn't expected such directness. I'm broken, Jake, Rose continued, used and discarded and carrying another man's child. But when you look at me, I don't feel broken. I feel like maybe I could be whole again. That's dangerous thinking for both of us. Jake turned to face her fully. You think I'm not broken. You think I don't see the same possibility in you. What are you saying? I'm saying maybe we're both fools, but maybe that's what it takes to survive out here. A little foolishness. A little hope. The decision when it came happened over the course of 3 extraordinary days that would forever change the course of their lives. The first day began with Jake riding to check on a distant fence line, a routine task that should have taken no more than 4 hours. Rose watched him go from the porch, Thomas's movements strong within her belly, a nagging unease she couldn't quite name settling in her chest. Be careful, she called out, though there was no reason for the warning. Jake turned in his saddle smiling. Always am. Keep that rifle handy. By noon, Rose had reorganized the pantry twice and mended 3 shirts that didn't really need mending. The unease had grown into genuine worry. Jake was punctual to a fault. If he said 4 hours, he meant 4 hours. When the 5th hour passed with no sign of him, Rose made a decision. She was struggling into her coat, determined to search for him despite her injured ankle when she heard horses approaching. Multiple horses moving fast. Her blood turned to ice. She grabbed the rifle Jake had taught her to use, checking that it was loaded, and positioned herself behind the heavy table. The door burst open, but instead of Marcus's men, it was Jake supported by 2 strangers. Blood ran down his face from a gash on his forehead, and his right arm hung at an unnatural angle. Jake! She dropped the rifle, hobbling toward him as fast as her injury allowed. It's all right, one of the men said quickly. He was older, weathered with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. Horse spooked at a mountain cat, threw him hard. Found him trying to walk back, stubborn fool. Weren't going to leave you alone. Jake mumbled his words slurred but insistent. Not with Marcus out there. Get him to the bed. Rose ordered, her mind shifting into crisis mode. Years of tending to Elizabeth's accidents had taught her emergency medicine. You bring clean water from the barrel. You help me get his coat off. The 2 men jumped to follow her commands. As they worked to remove Jake's wet, frozen clothing, Rose noticed how carefully they handled him with the competence of men who dealt with injuries before. I'm Frank Holloway, the older man said as they worked. This is my nephew Tom Bailey. We ranch about 8 miles east. Jake hired me last week to help with his spring calving. Rose remembered Jake mentioning Frank, though they'd never met. Thank you for bringing him home. Would have done it for anyone, Tom said, though his expression suggested otherwise. But Jake's good people helped us out of a tight spot last year. As they settled Jake into bed, he became more lucid, his eyes focusing on Rose with an intensity that made her heart race. Rose, he said urgently, gripping her hand. Need to tell you something. Been thinking about it all morning before the cat spooked the horse. Like maybe God was giving me one last chance to say it. You're going to be fine, Rose said, examining the head wound. It was messy, but not deep. Save your strength. No need to say this. Jake struggled to sit up despite the pain it clearly caused him. The marriage offer I made. Want you to know it wasn't just for protection. Frank and Tom exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly wishing they were anywhere else. Jake, you're hurt confused. Not confused. His good hand found hers, gripping with surprising strength. Been clearer about this than anything in my life. You and that baby. You've made me want to live again, not just exist. These past weeks, watching you make this place a home, seeing you stand up to your fears. Rose, I'm in love with you. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Rose felt tears streaming down her face. Here was this man, injured and vulnerable, offering her not just protection, but his heart. You don't know me, she whispered. Not really. The things I've done, I know enough. Know you're brave enough to run when staying meant death. Know you're strong enough to carry a child alone into uncertainty. Know you're kind enough to care for a broken soldier who'd given up on life. Jake's eyes never left hers. That's all I need to know. Frank cleared his throat. Ma'am, I should mention I'm also the justice of the peace for the county. Been so for 3 years now. Rose looked at him in shock. You could marry us, if that's what you both want, though might want to clean him up first, make it proper like. No, Jake said firmly. Now, tonight. Tomorrow might be too late if Marcus finds us. Jake, this is too fast. You're injured not thinking. Rose. Jake's voice was calm, now certain. I've made a lot of decisions in my life. Some good, most bad. But this is the clearest, truest decision I've ever made. The question is, what do you want? Rose looked at this man who'd saved her life, who'd offered her shelter without question, who was now offering her his name, his protection, his love. She thought about all the reasons to say no. They barely knew each other. She was carrying another man's child, possibly. Marcus would never stop hunting them. It was too fast, too dangerous, too uncertain. But then she thought about the past 3 days, how empty the cabin had felt during the brief times Jake had been gone. She thought about the way he looked at her, not with pity or calculation, but with genuine care. She thought about her child growing up with a father like Jake, steady and strong and kind. We need witnesses, she said softly. Tom Bailey grinned. I'll stand witness. Known Jake 2 years now. Never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. Then yes, Rose said, her voice growing stronger. Yes, I'll marry you, Jake Morgan. What followed was perhaps the strangest wedding in Montana Territory history. Jake propped up in bed with a bandaged head and his arm in a makeshift sling that Rose had fashioned from torn sheets. Rose standing beside him on her crutch, still wearing his oversized coat over her nightgown, her hair loose and wild around her shoulders. Frank Holloway speaking the ceremonial words, while Tom held a lantern for light, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Before we begin, Frank said formally, I need to ask, is this of your own free will? Both of you. It is, they said in unison. And you understand the legal implications. Once married, you're bound in the eyes of the law and God. We understand, Jake said, then added with a slight smile, though I should mention, Frank, that my bride comes with some complications. Frank's expression grew serious. What kind of complications? Rose took a breath. There's a man who claims I belong to him. Marcus Thornton. He's hunting me. Frank and Tom exchanged glances. Everyone in the territory knew that name. You running from Thornton? Frank asked carefully. I'm running from a man who killed his wife and wanted to steal my child, Rose said firmly. Whether that makes me a criminal or a survivor, I'll let you judge. Frank was quiet for a long moment, then nodded. My boy got caught up with the wrong crowd few years back, rustling cattle. Jake could have turned him in, gotten a nice reward. Instead, he kept quiet, gave the boy a chance to straighten up. My son's a lawyer in Denver now, thanks to that second chance. He looked at Rose. Everyone deserves a chance to start over. Then let's proceed, Jake said. Frank pulled out a worn Bible from his coat. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here tonight, irregular as the circumstances may be, to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony. As Frank spoke the traditional words, Rose found herself thinking about another wedding years ago in Boston, where she'd watched a cousin marry in a grand cathedral with hundreds of guests and a dress that cost more than most people made in a year. That bride had looked terrified beneath her veil, marrying for money and position rather than love. Here, in this simple cabin, with blood on the groom's face and dust on her nightgown, Rose felt more like a true bride than that cousin ever had. Jake Morgan, Frank continued, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death do you part? I do. Jake said, his voice strong despite his injuries. I take Rose and her child as my family to protect and cherish, no matter what comes. The addition wasn't part of the traditional vows, but Frank didn't correct him. Rose Winter, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, For better or worse, till death do you part. Rose thought about correcting her name, then decided it didn't matter. Winifred Gladstone was dead. She died in that snowbank. Rose Winter was being reborn as Rose Morgan. I do, she said, then added her own modification. I take Jake as my husband and my child's father to stand beside through whatever trials may come. The rings? Frank asked. No rings, Jake said, then paused. Wait. He struggled to pull something from around his neck with his good hand, a thin leather cord with a simple silver band hanging from it. This was my mother's. Been carrying it since the war. Never thought I'd have use for it. Rose's hands shook as Jake slipped the worn band onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Montana, I pronounce you man and wife. Frank smiled. You may kiss the bride if you can manage it without passing out. Jake pulled Rose down gently with his good arm. Their lips met in a kiss that was tender and promising despite the circumstances. When they parted, both were breathless, and Rose could taste the salt of her own tears. Well, Tom Bailey said, breaking the moment with obvious relief. That's not how I expected this evening to go. Came to help with an injured man, ended up witnessing a wedding. Frank produced a paper from his coat. Need you both to sign this, make it legal. Tom and I will witness. As Rose signed Rose Morgan for the first time, her hand trembled. The weight of what they'd just done was settling in. She was married to a man she'd known for less than a week, a man who was injured and might have been speaking from delirium. Stop thinking so hard, Jake said softly, watching her face. I meant every word. After Frank and Tom left, promising to file the marriage certificate in town and to keep quiet about the whole affair, Rose tended to Jake's injuries properly. The head wound needed cleaning and stitching, which she did with steady hands despite his occasional grunts of pain. You've done this before, Jake observed as she worked. Too many times, Rose replied quietly. Elizabeth was clumsy, especially when Marcus was displeased. Jake caught her hand as she finished the last stitch. That's over now. You're Rose Morgan, my wife, under my protection. Your protection might not be enough against Marcus. Then we'll face him together as husband and wife. Rose helped him remove his torn shirt, gasping at the bruising across his ribs. As she wound bandages around his torso, her hands careful and gentle, Jake spoke quietly. I need you to know something. What I said about loving you, that wasn't the head injury talking. I've been feeling it for days, fighting it, telling myself it was too soon, too complicated. But when that horse threw me, when I was lying in the snow, thinking I might not make it back, all I could think about was that I'd never told you. Rose tied off the bandage, then sat on the edge of the bed. I don't know if I can love you back. Not yet. Too much has happened, too much damage. I'm not asking you to love me back, Jake interrupted. I'm just asking you to stay, to give us a chance, to let me be a father to your child and a husband to you in whatever way you're comfortable with. And if Marcus comes, when Marcus comes, Jake corrected, we'll be ready. A married woman has legal protections, a single woman doesn't. And Marcus will have to go through me to get to you. He's killed men for less. He's never faced a man with something worth dying for. Rose studied Jake's battered face, seeing the determination there. You'd die for us, for a woman you barely know, and a child that isn't yours. I'd prefer to live for you, Jake said with a slight smile. But yes, if it comes to that. Why? Rose whispered. Why would you do this? Jake was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. You know what I thought about lying in that snow. Not the war. Not the men I lost. Not Mary Catherine or the life I didn't get to live. I thought about you here waiting. I thought about your child growing up without a mother if something happened to you. I thought about this cabin going back to being just a place where I marked time until death finally caught up. He met her eyes. You've given me a reason to want tomorrow, Rose. That's worth everything to me." Rose felt tears sliding down her cheeks. Without thinking, she leaned forward and kissed him gently, careful of his injuries. This kiss was different from their wedding kiss, softer, more exploratory, a question rather than a declaration. When she pulled back, Jake's eyes were bright with emotion. Was that gratitude or something else? "I don't know," Rose answered honestly. "Maybe both. Maybe the beginning of something else." "I'll take it," Jake said. "I'll take whatever you're willing to give." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their new bond settling around them like a blanket. Outside, snow began to fall again, but inside the cabin was warm and safe. "We should probably figure out the practical things," Rose said eventually. "Sleeping arrangements, daily routines." "You'll keep the bed," Jake said immediately. "I'll take the floor by the fire." "Jake, you're injured, and you're pregnant. The bed is yours." His tone brooked no argument. "What about marital relations?" Rose asked, her cheeks burning. Jake's expression softened. "That's your choice, Rose. Always. This marriage is for protection, for giving you and the baby a name and a home. Anything else, that only happens if and when you want it to." The relief that flooded through her was overwhelming. "Thank you." "Don't thank me for basic decency," Jake said. "Now you should get some rest. Tomorrow we'll need to figure out our next moves." But Rose wasn't ready to leave his side yet. "Tell me about your mother, the one whose ring I'm wearing." Jake's expression grew distant. "Her name was Margaret, strongest woman I ever knew until I met you. Raised 3 boys mostly on her own, while my father was off fighting one war or another. Mexican War, then local skirmishes. He was a soldier, first, father second." "Is that why you joined following in his footsteps?" "Partly. Also partly to get away from the farm, see the world. Foolish boy dreams." Jake shifted, wincing as the movement pulled his ribs. "Mother tried to talk me out of it. Said I had too gentle a heart for war. She was right. Yet you survived. My body did. The rest, well, you've seen what's left." Rose squeezed his hand. "I've seen a good man who's been hurt but not broken. Not completely. You see what you want to see. I see what's there. The same thing Frank Holloway saw when he trusted you with his son's future. The same thing those men saw today when they brought you home instead of leaving you to freeze." The morning after their impromptu wedding dawned clear and cold, with sunlight streaming through the frosted windows like a benediction. Rose woke first, momentarily disoriented by the warm presence beside her. Jake was still sleeping, his face relaxed in a way she'd never seen it while he was awake. The harsh lines around his eyes had softened, making him look younger, closer to the man he might have been before the war. She studied him in the morning light, this man who was now her husband. It seemed impossible, like something out of the dime novels she used to read secretly in Boston. Yet here was the marriage certificate on the bedside table bearing both their signatures and making it real. "You're staring," Jake said without opening his eyes. "How did you know?" "Can feel it. Besides, your breathing changed." He opened one eye. "Having regrets?" "No," Rose said, surprising herself with how much she meant it. "You. Only that I can't properly hold my wife with this damn shoulder." The casual way he said "wife" sent an unexpected warmth through her. "Your shoulder needs rest. Doctor's orders." "You're not a doctor." "I'm the closest thing you've got out here, so you'll listen to me." Jake smiled, the expression transforming his usually stern features. "Yes, ma'am." "Mrs. Morgan." Over the next days, they settled into an unexpected rhythm. Jake's injuries forced him to accept Rose's help with tasks he normally handled alone, while Rose's improving ankle allowed her to take on more household duties. They moved around each other carefully at first, like dancers learning new steps, but gradually found their balance. "You don't have to do all this," Jake said one afternoon, watching Rose reorganize his meager pantry. She'd somehow managed to create twice the storage space just by rearranging things. "I need to contribute something. I can't just sit here being protected. You're growing a baby. That's contribution enough." Rose's hand went to her belly, now prominently round. "This baby needs a proper home. Not just shelter, but a real home." Jake watched as she continued her work, humming softly. It was a hymn he recognized from childhood before the war, when Sunday services meant something more than just marking time. "My mother used to sing that," he said quietly. Rose paused. "Mine too. Amazing Grace." She said it was about finding your way when you're lost. "Were you lost?" "Completely. Until a stubborn cowboy pulled me out of a snowbank." She turned to face him. "Jake, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest." "Always am. What happens when this baby comes out looking nothing like me? If Charlie's blue eyes are looking back at us?" Jake was quiet for a moment, considering. "Then we'll have a blue-eyed baby to raise. Our baby. But people will talk. They'll know, let them know. Let them talk." Jake's voice was firm. "Half the children in this territory have uncertain parentage. What matters is who raises them, who loves them. You could love another man's child." "I already do," Jake said simply. "Started the moment I felt a kick." Rose had to turn away to hide the tears that threatened. These pregnancy emotions were getting the better of her more and more lately. "We need supplies," she said, changing the subject. "Baby things. Cloth for diapers at least. And we're low on flour and coffee. I'll ride to town tomorrow." "No, we'll ride to town. I'm going with you." Jake started to protest, then stopped. She was right. They were married now publicly and legally. Hiding her away would only fuel more speculation. "All right, but we go armed and we stay together." The trip to Cedar Ridge the next day was Rose's first real venture into civilization since her flight from Marcus. She wore her best remaining dress, carefully mended with Jake's coat over it for warmth. Jake had polished his boots and worn his church clothes such as they were. They looked like what they were, a newly married couple from the frontier, respectable if not wealthy. The general store was run by the Hendersons, an elderly couple who'd been in Cedar Ridge since before it had a name. Mrs. Henderson's eyes lit up when she saw Rose. "Jake Morgan, you sly dog. Got yourself married without telling anyone." It was sudden, Jake said, helping Rose navigate the steps with her still tender ankle. "Mrs. Henderson, Mr. Henderson, this is my wife, Rose." "Pleased to meet you," Rose said, extending her hand. "Mrs." Henderson ignored the hand and pulled Rose into a careful hug, mindful of her obvious condition. "Oh, my dear, how wonderful, and a baby on the way, too. When? 2 months, maybe less," Rose answered, finding herself genuinely warmed by the woman's enthusiasm. "Your first?" "Yes." "Well, don't you worry. We've all been through it out here. You need anything at all, you send Jake to fetch me." Mrs. Henderson was already pulling Rose toward the fabric section. "Now, let's see about getting you properly supplied." Jake watched them go, a bemused expression on his face. Mr. Henderson clapped him on the shoulder. "Women folk always get excited about babies," the older man said. "How long you been married, son?" "Just a week," Jake answered honestly. Henderson's eyebrows rose slightly, taking in Rose's advanced pregnancy, but he said nothing. Out here, people minded their own business when it came to such matters. "Well, marriage changes a man, usually for the better." Henderson pulled out his pipe. "Though I heard tell Marcus Thornton's been asking around about a pregnant woman traveling alone, offering a substantial reward." Jake kept his expression neutral. "That's so, says she's disturbed in the mind, needs medical attention. Stole from him too, supposedly. Lot of pregnant women in the territory. Not many fitting the description he's giving. Dark-haired, green-eyed, educated sounding." Henderson's eyes were shrewd. "Course, nobody around here's seen anyone like that. Your Rose is blonde, isn't she?" Jake met the older man's gaze steadily. "That's right. Blonde as summer wheat." Henderson nodded slowly. "That's what I thought. Well, best keep her close. Dangerous times for women traveling alone." The message was clear. Henderson knew, or at least suspected, but he was choosing to stay quiet. Jake felt a rush of gratitude for the unspoken code of the frontier. Meanwhile, Rose was experiencing her own revelation. Mrs. Henderson had led her to a back corner where several other women were gathered, apparently a regular coffee klatch. "Ladies, this is Rose Morgan, Jake's new bride," Mrs. Henderson announced. The women, ranging in age from early 20s to late 50s, all turned to examine her with friendly curiosity. Jake Morgan got married. One of them, a redhead with twin toddlers clinging to her skirts, exclaimed. "Will wonders never cease? We thought he'd die a bachelor for sure." Another added, "Barely speaks 2 words when he comes to town." "Well, he speaks plenty at home," Rose said, surprising herself with the defensive tone. The women laughed not unkindly. "Good for you, honey," the redhead said. "I'm Margaret Bailey. My Tom helped witness your wedding, I heard." Rose blushed. It was rather unexpected. "The best marriages often are," Mrs. Henderson said sagely. "Now let's talk about what you really need for this baby." What followed was an education in frontier motherhood. The women shared advice, remedies, and warnings with the casual expertise of those who delivered babies in cabins far from any doctor. They pressed gifts on her hand-sewn baby clothes, a knitted blanket, a small wooden rattle carved by someone's husband. "We look after each other out here," Margaret explained. "Has to be that way." "But you don't even know me," Rose protested, overwhelmed by the generosity. "You're Jake's wife. That makes you one of us now," Mrs. Henderson said firmly. "Besides, any woman brave enough to take on that hermit deserves all the help she can get." The women laughed again, and Rose found herself joining in. For the first time since Elizabeth's death, she felt the warmth of female friendship. When Jake came to collect her an hour later, she was laden with packages and pink-cheeked from laughter. "Make friends?" he asked, amused. "I think so. They're planning a quilting bee next week. I'm invited." "A quilting bee," Jake repeated as if the words were foreign. "At our place, at Margaret Bailey's. Is that all right?" Jake looked at his wife, saw the happiness in her eyes, and nodded. "Course it is." As they loaded their purchases onto the wagon they'd brought, a man Rose didn't recognize approached. He was well-dressed for the frontier with a pearl-handled pistol at his hip. "Mr. Morgan," he said, tipping his hat. "Mrs. Morgan." "Daniels." Jake replied, his tone neutral, but his body tensing. "Heard congratulations are in order." Daniels continued, his eyes lingering on Rose's pregnant form. "Marriage and a baby. You've been busy." "Life moves fast out here," Jake said evenly. "Indeed it does. Some might say too fast. Some might wonder about the timeline of things." Jake stepped slightly in front of Rose. "Some might mind their own business." Daniels smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Of course, just making conversation. Though I should mention I've been hired to find someone. A woman, pregnant, traveling alone. There's a substantial reward." "Can't help you," Jake said flatly. "No. Well, if you hear anything." Daniels produced a card. "I'm staying at the boarding house." After he walked away, Rose whispered, "He knows." "He suspects. Different thing entirely." Jake helped her onto the wagon seat. "But we need to be careful. Daniels is a bounty hunter, and a good one." The quilting bee at Margaret Bailey's ranch was Rose's first real social gathering as Mrs. Jake Morgan. She sat awkwardly on a cushioned chair, her swollen belly making it difficult to lean forward to reach the quilting frame. Around her, 6 other women worked with practiced efficiency, their needles flashing in the afternoon light streaming through the Bailey's front windows. "You'll get the hang of it," Margaret assured her, noticing Rose's clumsy stitches. "Though Lord knows you won't have much time for quilting once that baby arrives." "My first took so much time I didn't pick up a needle for 2 years," laughed Sarah Whitman, the banker's wife. Despite her husband's position, she was down to earth and kind, having come from humble beginnings herself. Speaking of which, Mrs. Henderson said, her eyes twinkling, "Have you thought about names?" Rose glanced nervously at the other women. This was dangerous territory. "We've discussed a few options. If it's a boy, you should name him after Jake," suggested Anna Carlson, the youngest of the group at barely 19. "Jake Jr. has a nice ring to it." "Jake says the baby should have its own name," Rose said carefully, "not carry someone else's burden." The women nodded approvingly. "Smart man," Mrs. Henderson said. "My Harold Jr. spent his whole life trying to live up to his father's name. Would have been better off as his own person." "What was your father's name?" "Rose," Margaret asked innocently. Rose's mind went blank for a moment. She couldn't remember if she'd told anyone a backstory. "William," she said, finally picking the most common name she could think of. "William Morgan. That's got a nice sound," Anna said. "Though I prefer something stronger, like Thomas. Tom Morgan sounds like a man who could handle himself." "Let's hope it's a girl, then," Sarah interjected with a laugh. "Save us all from another tough-talking cowboy who thinks he knows everything." The women chuckled, and Rose felt herself relaxing into their easy camaraderie. This was what she'd missed all those years as Elizabeth's companion, genuine friendship without calculation or pretense. "Rose dear," Mrs. Henderson said gently, "we've all noticed you don't talk much about your people. Where did you say you were from originally?" The question she'd been dreading. Rose kept her eyes on her stitching. "Back east. My family. We weren't close." "That why you came west alone?" Margaret asked, her tone carefully neutral. Rose felt the weight of their collective attention. These women had accepted her, helped her, embraced her as one of their own. They deserved some version of the truth. "I was in a difficult situation," she said slowly. "Someone with power wanted something from me I couldn't give. When I refused, he made my life impossible. I had to leave." The women exchanged knowing looks. They'd all heard variations of this story before. The West was full of women running from bad situations. "Well, you're safe now," Sarah said firmly. "Jake Morgan's a good man, stubborn as a mule and about as social as a rattlesnake, but good through and through." "How long has he been out here alone?" Rose asked, grateful for the change of subject. 5 years, give or take," Mrs. Henderson replied. "Showed up one spring with barely more than the clothes on his back and a determination to be left alone. Bought that land from old Murphy's widow, paid cash. Folks were curious, of course, but Jake made it clear he wasn't interested in sharing his story." "Until you came along," Margaret added with a smile. "Never seen a man change so fast. Tom says Jake actually smiled at him the other day. Nearly fell off his horse from the shock." Before Rose could respond, the sound of approaching horses made them all look up. Through the window, they could see a small group of riders approaching fast. Too fast for a social call. Tom Bailey burst through the door, his face flushed with exertion. "Ladies, sorry to interrupt, but Rose, you need to come. Jake's been arrested." The needle fell from Rose's numb fingers. "What? Why?" "That bounty hunter Daniels. He's claiming Jake stole cattle from Marcus Thornton's ranch. Says he's got evidence." Rose struggled to her feet, the other women immediately surrounding her with support. "That's impossible. Jake hasn't left our ranch except to come to town." "Of course it's impossible," Tom said grimly, "but Daniels has a witness saying otherwise. They're holding Jake at the sheriff's office until the circuit judge arrives next week." "I need to see him," Rose said, already moving toward the door. "Now hold on," Mrs. Henderson said, catching her arm. "You can't go rushing into town in your condition. Let Tom and some of the other men handle this." "He's my husband." Rose's voice rose with panic. "This is happening because of me. Marcus is using Jake to get to me." The women exchanged glances. They'd suspected something was off about Rose's sudden appearance and marriage to Jake, but frontier courtesy had kept them from asking questions. Margaret stepped forward. "Then we handle it together. Tom, ride ahead and tell Jake that Rose is safe with us. Anna, fetch your husband and mine. Mrs. Henderson, can you send someone for Doc Simmons, just in case Rose needs him?" "What are you doing?" Rose asked, overwhelmed by the sudden activity. "What we do out here," Margaret said firmly. "We protect our own." "But you don't even really know me," Rose protested, tears threatening. Sarah Whitman stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Rose's shoulder. "We know enough. We know you make Jake happy. We know you're about to bring a child into this world. And we know you're being hunted by a man who thinks his money makes him God. That's all we need to know." Within an hour, a small convoy headed toward Cedar Ridge. Rose rode in the Bailey's wagon, surrounded by women who'd armed themselves with more than just good intentions. Mrs. Henderson carried a shotgun across her lap. Margaret had a pistol tucked into her belt, and even young Anna had a rifle propped beside her. "You ladies always travel armed?" Rose asked. "Only when our menfolk are being idiots," Mrs. Henderson replied, "which is more often than you'd think." The sheriff's office was a small building next to the general store. A crowd had gathered outside, drawn by the drama of Jake Morgan actually being arrested for something. Sheriff Coleman, a thin, nervous man who'd won his position, mainly because nobody else wanted it, stood on the porch trying to maintain order. "Now, folks, this is a legal matter. Mr. Daniels has presented evidence." What evidence? Tom Bailey demanded, having arrived ahead of them. "Jake Morgan's as honest as they come." "There's a witness," Coleman said weakly. "Man named Parsons says he saw Jake running Thornton cattle onto his land 3 nights ago." "Parsons," someone in the crowd scoffed. "That drunk couldn't see straight on his best day, and everyone knows Thornton's been paying his bar tab." Rose pushed her way forward the crowd, parting respectfully for the pregnant woman. "Sheriff Coleman, I need to see my husband." "Ma'am, I don't think—" "Now, Sheriff." Rose's voice carried the authority of her Boston upbringing. "Or would you prefer I telegraph the territorial governor? My father was William Gladstone of Boston. Perhaps you've heard of the Gladstone banking family." It was a dangerous gambit, invoking her real father's name, but it worked. Coleman's eyes widened, and he quickly unlocked the door. "5 minutes, Mrs. Morgan." Inside, Jake sat on a narrow cot in the single cell, his head in his hands. He looked up when he heard footsteps, and his expression shifted from relief to concern when he saw Rose. "You shouldn't be here." "Where else would I be?" She gripped the bars, wishing she could touch him. "This is Thornton's doing." "I know." Jake's voice was low. Daniels practically admitted it. Said this could all go away if you'd just come have a conversation with his employer. "I'll kill him first," Rose said fiercely. "No, you'll do no such thing." Jake moved closer to the bars. "Listen to me. Tom Bailey's riding to Fort Benton to find a real lawyer. This won't hold up in any legitimate court. A week, Jake. You'll be in here a week until the judge comes." "I've survived worse." He reached through the bars to touch her face. "You need to stay with the Baileys. Don't go back to the ranch alone." "Jake Morgan," a smooth voice said from the doorway. "How the mighty have fallen." They turned to see Daniels leaning against the doorframe, his pearl-handled pistol prominently displayed. "Mrs. Morgan," he continued, tipping his hat mockingly. "Or should I say, Miss Gladstone." Rose's blood ran cold, but she kept her expression steady. "I don't know what you're talking about." "No. Well, perhaps this will refresh your memory." Daniels produced a photograph from his jacket. It was Rose, taken at some society function in Boston years ago. The resemblance was undeniable. "Interesting," Jake said calmly. "But that proves nothing except that my wife resembles someone from back east. Happens all the time. Perhaps. Or perhaps Mrs. Morgan would like to avoid all this unpleasantness. Mr. Thornton is a reasonable man. He just wants to talk." "Mr. Thornton can go to hell," Rose said clearly. Daniel's expression hardened. "That's unfortunate, because things can get so much worse. For instance, did you know that aiding and abetting a fugitive is a hanging offense in this territory?" "Good thing my wife's not a fugitive then," Jake said evenly. We'll see what the judge says about that. Daniels straightened. You have one day, Mrs. Morgan, come to me voluntarily, or I'll make sure your husband hangs for helping you. After he left, Rose turned back to Jake, tears streaming down her face. I can't let you die for me. Nobody's dying, Jake said firmly. This is intimidation, nothing more. Thornton knows he can't prove anything legally, so he's trying to scare you into surrendering. Before Rose could respond, Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway. Rose, dear, you need to come. Now. Outside, the women had formed a protective circle around a well-dressed stranger. The woman stood beside an expensive carriage, her face hidden by a deep bonnet. When Rose approached, the woman turned and Rose gasped. It was Elizabeth Thornton's sister, Caroline, a woman who supposedly lived in Europe and never had contact with the family. Hello, Winifred, Caroline said quietly. Or should I call you Rose now? The crowd murmured at this revelation, but Margaret Bailey quickly took charge. Everyone inside the general store. Mrs. Henderson, perhaps you could make some of your coffee. This looks like a conversation that needs privacy. As the crowd reluctantly dispersed, Caroline stepped closer to Rose. We need to talk. I have something that might save your husband and destroy Marcus permanently. How did you find me? Elizabeth wrote to me before she died. She told me everything about Marcus, about you, about what he did to both of you. Caroline's voice was tight with controlled anger. I've been searching for you for months. They moved into the Hendersons' back room, where Caroline produced a leather journal from her bag. Elizabeth's real diary, the one Marcus never found. She documented everything, every crime, every murder, every payoff. Names, dates, amounts. Rose's hands shook as she took the journal. This could free Jake. This could destroy Marcus completely. But there's more. Caroline paused, seeming to gather her courage. Elizabeth discovered something right before she died. Marcus can't have children, never could. A childhood illness left him sterile. The implications hit Rose like a physical blow. Then why? Why does he want your baby? Because he needs an heir to keep his empire. His investors are getting nervous about succession. A baby, any baby he could claim, would solve that problem. He'll never have my child, Rose said fiercely. No, he won't, because I've already telegraphed a federal marshal I trust, Judge Harrison from Denver, too. They'll be here in 3 days. 3 days, Rose repeated. Can Jake survive 3 days in that cell? Before Caroline could answer, gunshots rang out from the street. The women rushed to the windows to see Daniels and several rough-looking men facing off against Tom Bailey and a group of local ranchers. You can't hold us all off, Tom was saying, his rifle steady. Jake Morgan is one of us. We won't let you railroad him. This is legal business, Daniels replied, though his hand hovered near his pistol. Interfere, and you'll all hang. Then we'll hang together, Frank Holloway said, stepping out from the crowd. Rose recognized him as the man who'd witnessed their wedding. But you'll go first. The tension stretched taut as a bowstring. Then Sheriff Coleman emerged from his office, looking even more nervous than usual. Everyone calm down, he said, his voice cracking. No need for bloodshed. Tell that to Thornton, someone shouted. He's the one starting a range war over a pregnant woman. Rose stepped out onto the porch, despite the protests of the women behind her. Mr. Daniels, she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the street. You want me to come with you? Rose, no. She heard Jake's voice from inside the jail. Daniels smiled coldly. Now you're being sensible. I'll make you a deal, Rose continued. Let my husband go, and I'll come willingly. No deal, Daniels said. You come with me, and maybe the judge goes easy on him. Then you get nothing, Rose said firmly. And in 3 days, when the federal marshal arrives with the evidence that Marcus Thornton is a murderer and a fraud, you'll be the one facing the hangman's noose. Daniel's smile faltered. What federal marshal? Caroline stepped forward, her bearing regal despite the frontier setting. The one I summoned. I'm Caroline Whitmore, Elizabeth Thornton's sister, and I have enough evidence to see Marcus hang 10 times over. The crowd murmured excitedly at this development. Daniel's hired men exchanged uncertain glances. "You're bluffing," Daniel said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "Am I?" Caroline held up the journal. Elizabeth documented everything, including the $5,000 Marcus paid you to kill a man named Charlie Hayworth last year. Rose gasped. Charlie, the possible father of her child. Daniels had killed him. The bounty hunter's face went pale. "You can't prove anything." "I can prove enough, and when Marshal Bennett arrives, you'll have a choice. Testify against Marcus or hang beside him." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then one of Daniel's hired men slowly backed away. "I didn't sign up for this," he muttered. "Going against federal marshals ain't worth any amount of money." Others followed suit, leaving Daniels standing alone in the street. "This isn't over," he snarled, but he was already backing toward his horse. "Yes, it is," Rose said quietly. "You just don't know it yet." The 3 days waiting for the federal marshal felt like 3 years. Rose stayed at the Bailey Ranch, surrounded by protective neighbors who took turns standing guard. Jake remained in jail, though the townspeople made sure he was well fed and comfortable, much to Sheriff Coleman's nervous dismay. On the second night, Rose was awakened by the sound of horses. Many horses. She peered through the window to see torches approaching the ranch, at least 20 riders moving with purpose through the darkness. Rose, Margaret Bailey, burst into her room. "They're coming. Tom's gathering the men, but it's Marcus." Rose said, her voice surprisingly calm. She'd known this moment would come. "He's done waiting." She dressed quickly, her movements hampered by her pregnant belly. The baby had been restless all day, as if sensing the tension. Outside, she could hear Tom Bailey shouting orders, the sound of rifles being loaded. By the time she reached the main room, the riders had surrounded the house. Through the window, she could see him, Marcus Thornton himself, sitting tall on a black stallion, his face illuminated by torchlight. He looked exactly as she remembered, handsome in a cruel way, with dark eyes that held no warmth. "Mrs. Bailey," his voice carried clearly through the night air. "I know she's in there. Send her out, and no one gets hurt." "Go to hell, Thornton," Tom Bailey shouted back. Marcus sighed theatrically. "I tried to do this civilized. Daniels was supposed to handle things quietly, but no, you all had to make it complicated." His voice hardened. "You have 5 minutes. Send out my property, or I'll burn this place to the ground with everyone in it." "I'm nobody's property," Rose shouted through the window. "Ah, Winifred, there you are." Marcus's smile was cold. "You took something from me. 2 things, actually, my money and my child. Neither were ever yours. The law says otherwise. You were under my protection in my household. That makes you and everything you carry mine." Caroline stepped forward, Elizabeth's diary in her hand. "The law might be interested in this, Marcus. Your wife's detailed account of your crimes." Marcus's expression didn't change. "My dear sister-in-law, I heard you were in town. You always were too sentimental. That diary means nothing. The ravings of a sick woman." "Sick because you made her that way?" "Prove it." Marcus's voice was flat confident. "You think some journal will stand against my word? I own half the judges in this territory." "But not the federal ones," Rose said. Marcus laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "The federal marshal. Yes, I heard about that too. Shame about his accident." Rose's blood ran cold. What accident? The bridge at Miller's Creek washed out unexpectedly. Terrible tragedy. They found his body downstream this morning. "You murdered him," Caroline gasped. "I was here with 20 witnesses. How could I have had anything to do with a bridge collapse 50 miles away?" Marcus's smile was serpentine. "Accidents happen all the time out here. Why, this very ranch could catch fire from a dropped torch. These old buildings burned so quickly." As if on cue, one of his men tossed a torch toward the barn. Tom Bailey shot it out of the air, but the message was clear. "Enough games," Marcus said. "Winifred, you come with me now or everyone dies, starting with your precious Jake." "Jake's in jail. You can't touch him there." "Can't I?" Marcus pulled out a piece of paper. Sheriff Coleman was very accommodating when I explained the situation, signed Jake's release into my custody. For transfer to a more secure facility, of course. Shame if he tried to escape during transport. Rose felt her knees go weak. He'd thought of everything, covered every angle. "You have 1 minute," Marcus said. "Rose, no." Margaret gripped her arm. "We can fight them." "And how many will die?" Rose asked quietly. "How many widows and orphans for me?" "We made our choice," Tom said firmly. "We stand together." But Rose was already moving toward the door. She couldn't let these good people die for her. She'd brought enough death into the world through her association with the Thorntons. "Wait," Caroline called out. "Marcus, what if I could offer you something better than Winifred?" Marcus tilted his head, curious. "I'm listening." Elizabeth had another secret, one she didn't put in her diary. Caroline's voice was steady. "She had a son. Your son. She gave birth in secret 8 months ago, right before she died. I've been raising him in Denver." The lie was so bold, so unexpected, that everyone froze. Rose stared at Caroline in shock. Marcus's composure cracked for the first time. "You're lying." "Am I? Elizabeth was pregnant when she got sick. She hid it from you because she knew what you were, but the baby survived. Your heir, Marcus. Your blood. Where is he safe? And he'll stay that way, unless you leave these people alone." Marcus was silent for a long moment, calculating. A biological heir would be better than a stolen child. Blood meant everything to men like him. "Bring me the boy," he said finally. "Let Winifred go. Let them all go. Then we'll talk about the boy." "No deal, but I'll offer you this. Winifred comes with me now, and I won't burn this ranch. You have 3 days to produce this supposed heir. If you do, and blood tests prove he's mine, Winifred can go free." "Blood tests?" Caroline laughed bitterly. "Since when do you care about proof?" "Since you started lying to me." Marcus's voice was dangerous now. 3 days, Caroline. Produce the boy, or watch Winifred die." Rose knew she had no choice. Caroline had bought them time, but it was a desperate gambit. There was no baby. In 3 days, Marcus would know the truth, and his rage would be terrible. "I'll come," Rose said, stepping onto the porch. "No." The shout came from the darkness beyond Marcus's ring of riders. Then Jake emerged, flanked by Frank Holloway and Sheriff Coleman. The sheriff looked terrified. Jake looked deadly calm, and Frank had his rifle trained on Marcus. "How?" Marcus started. "Seems Sheriff Coleman had a change of heart," Frank said cheerfully. "Amazing what a man will do when he realizes he's been helping a murderer." "I didn't know," Coleman babbled. "He said it was all legal, but then the Hendersons showed me the diary pages, and I couldn't—" "Shut up," Marcus snarled. He looked at Jake. "You think you've won something here?" "I think you're outnumbered," Jake replied evenly. "My count shows 20 of your men against about 40 of ours." That's when Rose noticed them townspeople emerging from hidden positions all around the ranch. They'd been there all along, waiting. The general store owner, the blacksmith, even the saloon keeper, all armed, all ready to fight for one of their own. Marcus's men shifted nervously. They were hired guns, not soldiers. They hadn't signed up for a real battle. "This changes nothing," Marcus said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "I have legal claim." "You have nothing," a new voice interrupted. A woman's voice, strong and authoritative. Everyone turned to see a figure riding up the path. As she came into the torchlight, Rose gasped. It was Judge Patricia Harrison from Denver, the first female judge in the territory. Behind her rode 6 federal marshals. "Impossible," Marcus breathed. "You're supposed to be dead like Marshal Bennett." Judge Harrison dismounted, her movements deliberate. "Sorry to disappoint. When Bennett didn't check in, we suspected trouble. I brought backup." "This is territorial business," Marcus said desperately. "You have no jurisdiction. Murder is federal business, Mr. Thornton, as is kidnapping across state lines." The judge pulled out a warrant. "Marcus Thornton, you're under arrest for the murders of Elizabeth Thornton, Charlie Hayworth, and Marshal John Bennett, among others." "You can't prove any of that." Actually, we can. Daniel stepped out from behind one of the marshals. I've decided to take your sister-in-law's advice. Testifying against you seems healthier than hanging beside you. Marcus's face contorted with rage. You betraying piece of... His hand went for his gun, but Jake was faster. The shot echoed across the ranch, and Marcus's pistol went flying. He clutched his bleeding hand, his face twisted in pain and fury. "It's over, Thornton," Judge Harrison said calmly. "You can come quietly, or we can do this the hard way." For a moment, it seemed like Marcus might order his men to fight. Then Rose felt it, a sharp, intense pain that doubled her over. Rose. Jake was beside her instantly. The baby. She gasped. "It's coming." The timing couldn't have been worse, but nature didn't care about human drama. Another contraction hit stronger than the first. "Get her inside," Margaret ordered, taking charge. "Mrs. Henderson, we need hot water." Sarah fetched Doc Simmons. As the women bustled Rose inside, she heard Marcus laughing. "Perfect," he said. "Go ahead, arrest me. But that baby is still mine by law. I'll claim it from prison if I have to." "No," Judge Harrison said firmly. "You won't, because according to these marriage documents, Rose Morgan is married to Jake Morgan. That makes him the baby's legal father. That marriage is a fraud." "Prove it," Jake said, echoing Marcus's earlier words. "In court, with lawyers. See how far you get." The last thing Rose saw before another contraction consumed her was Marcus being led away in shackles, his empire crumbling around him. Inside the house, chaos of a different kind reigned. Doc Simmons had arrived, but he was shaking his head. "The baby's turned wrong," he said quietly. "This is going to be difficult." "Define difficult," Jake demanded, refusing to leave Rose's side despite propriety. "Dangerous, for both of them." Rose gripped Jake's hand as another wave of pain crashed over her. "If something happens..." "Nothing's going to happen," Jake said fiercely. "You're both going to be fine." "Promise me," Rose gasped. "If you have to choose, save the baby." "I'm not choosing. You're both coming through this." Hour after hour, the labor continued. Outside, dawn broke over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The federal marshals had taken Marcus and his men away, but the townspeople remained, keeping vigil. "Push Rose," Doc Simmons urged. "I know you're tired, but you have to push." Rose bore down with strength she didn't know she had left. Jake supported her, murmuring encouragement, his presence the anchor keeping her grounded. Then finally, miraculously, a cry pierced the air. Not Rose's cry of pain, but the healthy wail of a newborn. "It's a boy," Doc Simmons announced, his face bright with relief. "A healthy baby boy." Through her exhaustion, Rose heard the gasps from the women attending her. "Doc," Mrs. Henderson said slowly, "look at his eyes." Rose's heart stopped. The baby's eyes were open, and they were blue. Bright, unmistakable blue. Charlie's eyes, not Marcus's brown. "Well," Doc Simmons said after a moment, "lots of babies are born with blue eyes. They often change. It was a kindness that lie." Everyone in the room could see the truth. This child was not Marcus Thornton's son. Jake took the baby from Doc Simmons, cradling him with infinite gentleness. "Hey there, little man. I'm your papa." The baby stopped crying, seeming to focus on Jake's face. "What will you name him?" Margaret asked softly. Rose and Jake looked at each other. They hadn't discussed this, hadn't dared to plan that far ahead. "Thomas," Rose said finally. "Thomas Charlie Morgan." "After Charlie," Jake asked quietly, understanding. "After the father who gave him life," Rose said, tears streaming down her face. "And the father who'll give him love." Jake bent to kiss her forehead, then placed baby Thomas in her arms. "Our son," he said firmly, "in every way that matters." As Rose held her baby for the first time, surrounded by friends who'd risked everything for her, she realized that she'd found something she'd never thought possible: home. Not just a place, but a people. A family built not on blood, but on choice, sacrifice, and love. Outside, she could hear the townspeople celebrating. Marcus was gone, his threat ended. The baby was safe. Jake was free. They had won. But more than that, they had survived. And in the harsh, unforgiving territory of Montana, sometimes survival itself was the greatest victory of all. The weeks following Thomas's birth and Marcus's arrest passed in a blur of activity. Judge Harrison had set up a temporary court in Cedar Ridge to handle the complex legal proceedings. Marcus Thornton's empire, built on blood and intimidation, was crumbling piece by piece as witnesses found the courage to come forward. Rose sat in the courthouse, Thomas sleeping peacefully in her arms as she gave her testimony. Jake sat beside her, his presence a steady comfort. The courtroom was packed. It seemed everyone in the territory wanted to witness the fall of Marcus Thornton. Mrs. Morgan, the prosecutor, began gently. "Can you tell the court about your relationship with Marcus Thornton?" Rose took a deep breath. "I was never his wife, despite what he claimed. I was companion to his late wife, Elizabeth. After her death, he forced his attentions on me. When I became pregnant, he planned to marry me, claim the child, then have me committed to an asylum or killed." "Objection!" Marcus's lawyer shouted. "Speculation." "I have Elizabeth Thornton's diary to support my testimony," Rose said calmly. Caroline had already presented the diary as evidence, and its contents had shocked even the hardened frontier audience. "Continue, Mrs. Morgan," Judge Harrison said. "I fled when I learned of his plans. He pursued me across the territory, used his wealth and influence to have my husband falsely arrested, and threatened to burn down the Bailey Ranch with innocent families inside if I didn't surrender to him." "And the child?" the prosecutor asked carefully. "Is it Marcus Thornton's?" Rose looked directly at Marcus for the first time since the trial began. His face was twisted with rage, but underneath she saw something else, fear. He knew what was coming. "No," she said clearly. "My son is not Marcus Thornton's child." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Marcus shot to his feet. "She's lying. That child is mine." "Mr. Thornton, control yourself, or you'll be removed," Judge Harrison warned. "Your Honor," Rose continued, "I have proof. Doc Simmons can testify to Marcus's medical condition, a childhood illness that left him unable to father children. Elizabeth knew this. It's why she never gave him an heir despite years of marriage." Doc Simmons took the stand next, confirming what Elizabeth had discovered in medical records she'd stolen from Marcus's private files. The revelation destroyed Marcus's claim to Thomas and exposed years of deception about his supposed virility and power. But it was Daniel's testimony that sealed Marcus's fate. The bounty hunter, given immunity in exchange for his cooperation, detailed every crime Marcus had ordered, including Charlie Hayworth's murder. He wanted the drifter dead because he'd seen him with Mrs. Morgan. Daniels testified, said he couldn't risk any questions about the baby's parentage. "And Marshall Bennett?" the prosecutor asked. "Thornton ordered that too. Had the bridge supports weakened, then sent word about a fake emergency to ensure the marshal would cross at the right time." By the time all the testimony was complete, Marcus Thornton faced charges of multiple murders, attempted kidnapping, conspiracy, and fraud. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. "Guilty on all counts," the foreman announced. Judge Harrison nodded gravely. "Marcus Thornton, you are sentenced to hang by the neck until dead. Execution to be carried out in 1 week's time." Marcus's scream of rage echoed through the courthouse as they dragged him away. His last words were a threat. "This isn't over. I have friends, powerful friends." But his friends had already abandoned him. Within days, his cattle empire was being divided among his creditors and victims. The ranch house where Elizabeth had died was burned to the ground. Some said by accident, others said by the ghosts of those Marcus had wronged. Rose and Jake stood on a hill overlooking the ruins. Thomas bundled warmly against the spring breeze. "It's over," Rose said quietly. "Really over?" "The legal part, maybe," Jake replied. "But you're still healing." "We both are." It was true. The nightmares hadn't stopped for either of them. Rose still woke, sometimes thinking she heard Marcus's voice. Jake still reached for his gun at unexpected sounds, but they were getting better day by day. "The ranch is thriving," Jake said, changing the subject. "Frank's been a godsend with the cattle, and that new bull we bought should improve the herd significantly." Rose smiled. The reward money for Marcus's capture, a stunning $50,000, had been split among all who'd helped bring him down. Even with the split, Jake and Rose had received enough to expand their operation significantly. "Margaret wants to know if we're coming to the barn raising tomorrow," Rose said. "Tom's finally building that bigger barn he's been talking about for years." "Course we're coming. Man doesn't miss his neighbor's barn raising." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the mountains. Thomas stirred in Rose's arms, making the small sounds that preceded crying. "He's hungry," Rose said, already turning toward their wagon. "Growing boy," Jake said proudly. At 3 months old, Thomas was thriving. His eyes had stayed blue, confirming what everyone already knew, but no one mentioned it anymore. He was simply Thomas Morgan, son of Jake and Rose Morgan. As they drove home, they passed the spot where Jake had found Rose in the blizzard. It seemed like a lifetime ago, though it had been barely 6 months. "Do you ever think about if you hadn't come looking that night?" Rose asked. "Every day," Jake admitted. "I thank God every day that something made me go out in that storm." Their ranch came into view, and Rose smiled at the changes. The cabin had been expanded with 2 new rooms. A proper garden plot had been fenced off where Rose planned to plant vegetables come full spring. The barn was full of healthy cattle, the chicken coop bustling with fowl, but the biggest change was less visible the constant stream of visitors. The isolation Jake had once craved was gone, replaced by the warmth of community. People stopped by regularly to check on them, to share news, to help with projects. The Broken Arrow Ranch had become part of the fabric of Cedar Ridge. That evening, as they settled in for dinner, a knock came at the door. Jake answered it cautiously. Old habits died hard but relaxed when he saw Caroline standing there. "I'm heading back to Denver tomorrow," she said, accepting their invitation to come inside, "but I wanted to say goodbye properly." Over dinner, Caroline revealed her plans. "I'm using Elizabeth's inheritance, what Marcus didn't steal, to start a home for women in difficult circumstances, a place where they can go to escape situations like yours, Rose." "That's wonderful," Rose said, genuinely moved. "I'm calling it Elizabeth's Haven. She would have liked that, I think." "She would have," Rose agreed. Despite everything, she had a good heart. It just got lost under Marcus's shadow. Caroline held Thomas for a while, marveling at how much he'd grown. "He has kind eyes," she said, "like his father." She didn't specify which father she meant, and it didn't matter. After Caroline left, Rose and Jake sat on their porch, Thomas sleeping between them in the cradle Jake had built. "We've come a long way," Rose said. "Still got a ways to go," Jake replied. "Thomas'll need schooling eventually. Town's talking about building a proper school." "And more siblings," Rose added quietly. Jake looked at her in surprise. "You want more children, don't you?" Jake considered this. 6 months ago, he'd wanted nothing more than solitude. Now he couldn't imagine life without the chaos of family. "Yeah," he said finally. "I do." Rose smiled, taking his hand. "Good, because I think Thomas might have a brother or sister by Christmas." Jake's eyes widened. "You're pretty sure Doc Simmons confirmed it yesterday." Jake pulled her close, careful not to disturb Thomas. "Our family's growing." "Our family," Rose repeated, savoring the words. "I like the sound of that." As night fell over the Broken Arrow Ranch, they remained on the porch planning their future. There would be challenges ahead. There always were on the frontier. But they would face them together as a family, with the support of a community that had proven itself in the crucible of crisis. Marcus Thornton had been wrong about one thing. Rose had never been property to be claimed. She was a woman who'd found her strength in the worst of circumstances, a mother who'd fought for her child's freedom, a wife who'd chosen love over fear, and Jake. He was no longer the broken soldier hiding from his ghosts. He was a husband, a father, a member of a community that valued courage over isolation. Together, they were building something Marcus could never understand, a life based on love, trust, and mutual respect. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy, but it was theirs. Thomas stirred in his cradle, and Jake reached down to adjust his blanket. The baby's hand wrapped around Jake's finger, tiny but strong. "He's got a good grip," Jake said softly. "He'll need it," Rose replied. "This is still hard country." "But good country too," Jake said. "Country where a man can start over, where a woman can be free, where a child can grow up knowing he's loved." Rose leaned against her husband's shoulder, watching the stars emerge in the clear Montana sky. Somewhere out there, Marcus Thornton was spending his last days in a cell, his empire in ruins. But here, on this small ranch in the shadow of the mountains, life was beginning anew. 1 year later, on a brilliant June morning, the Broken Arrow Ranch buzzed with activity, unlike anything it had seen before. Tables made from sawhorses and planks stretched across the yard, covered with checkered cloths that fluttered in the warm breeze. Wild roses and Indian paintbrush filled mason jars at each table center, their colors vivid against the weathered wood. "Thomas, come back here," Rose called, laughing, as her son toddled determinedly toward the corrals where the horses stood, watching the commotion with curious eyes. At 18 months old, Thomas Morgan was a force of nature, all boundless energy and stubborn will. Jake scooped him up, settling the boy on his shoulders. "Can't have you getting dirty before the ceremony, little man." "Down, down," Thomas demanded, though he was giggling. Rose stood, one hand on her prominently pregnant belly, watching her boys with a heart so full it might burst. The second baby would arrive within the month, and Doc Simmons predicted a girl this time, though Rose knew better than to trust such predictions entirely. "You should be sitting," Margaret Bailey scolded, gently appearing with a glass of lemonade. "This is your day. Let us handle everything." "It's everyone's day," Rose corrected, accepting the drink gratefully. "The whole town's day." And it was. What had begun as Jake's suggestion for a proper wedding ceremony, since their first had been so hasty and unconventional, had grown into something larger, a celebration not just of their union, but of the community that had stood together against tyranny and won. "Never thought I'd see the day Jake Morgan threw a party," Frank Holloway said, approaching with his wife Martha, "much less one this big." "Never thought I'd see the day I'd want to," Jake admitted. Things change. The previous year had brought many changes. Marcus Thornton had been hanged on schedule going to his death, still raging against the world that had finally held him accountable. His empire had been completely dissolved, the lands distributed among local ranchers who worked them honestly. Some of his former cowboys, freed from his influence, had become respectable members of the community. The Broken Arrow Ranch had prospered beyond Jake's wildest dreams. With the help of their neighbors and the careful investment of their reward money, they'd expanded to nearly 1,000 acres. Their cattle bore the Broken Arrow brand with pride, and Jake had earned a reputation as one of the finest horsemen in the territory. But the biggest change was in the cabin itself. No longer a bachelor's spare dwelling, it had become a true home. Rose's touches were everywhere. Curtains at the windows, rag rugs on the floors, books on newly built shelves. The kitchen garden flourished under her care, and she'd even convinced Jake to help her plant apple trees that would bear fruit in years to come. "The minister's here," Sarah Whitman announced. "Should we gather everyone?" Rose and Jake exchanged glances. They were already married legally and truly. But Rose had confessed she'd always dreamed of a real wedding with flowers and music, and the people she loved as witnesses. Jake, who would have done anything to make her happy, had immediately begun planning. "I'll go change," Rose said, heading for the house where her wedding dress waited. It was an elaborate ivory muslin with small pearl buttons sewn by the combined efforts of the quilting bee ladies, but it was hers, chosen and created with love. Caroline had returned from Denver for the occasion, bringing news of Elizabeth's Haven success. 6 women had already found shelter there, escaping situations similar to Rose's. It was Elizabeth's true legacy. Caroline said something good, rising from the ashes of so much pain. As Rose dressed, helped by Margaret and Mrs. Henderson, she could hear the musicians tuning their instruments outside. Tom Bailey on fiddle, the blacksmith's son on guitar, even old Mr. Henderson with his harmonica. It would be nothing like the grand society orchestras of Boston, but it was perfect. "You look beautiful," Caroline said softly, adjusting Rose's veil, "like a woman who's found her place in the world." "I have," Rose said simply. "It took a strange and painful path to get here, but I'm exactly where I'm meant to be." Outside, Jake waited at the makeshift altar, Thomas in his arms, wearing a tiny suit Mrs. Henderson had sewn. Jake himself wore his best clothes, his hair neatly trimmed, his boots polished to a shine. But it was the expression on his face that made Rose's breath catch as she emerged from the house, pure love, unmarred by shadows or doubt. The ceremony was simple but profound. This time, when the minister asked if she took Jake as her husband, Rose's "I do" rang clear and strong across the gathering. When Jake slipped the ring on her finger, a simple gold band he'd had the jeweler in Fort Benton make specially, his hands were steady and sure. "I now pronounce you again husband and wife," the minister said with a smile. "You may kiss your bride." The kiss was different from their first wedding kiss, which had been tentative and born of crisis. This was the kiss of 2 people who'd weathered storms together, who'd built something beautiful from the rubble of their separate broken pasts. As they parted, Thomas clapped his chubby hands and shouted, "Mama, Papa," which sent ripples of laughter through the crowd. The celebration that followed would be remembered in Cedar Ridge for years. Tables groaned under the weight of food, venison, and beef fresh bread pies of every description. The musicians played well into the night, and even Jake was convinced to dance, holding Rose carefully as they swayed to a waltz. "No regrets?" Rose asked as they moved together. "Only one," Jake said. Rose looked up at him in concern. "I regret it took me so long to find you," he said. "Or maybe that it took so long for you to find me." "We found each other when we were meant to," Rose said. "When we were ready." As the evening wore on, Doc Simmons stood to make a toast. "To Jake and Rose Morgan," he said, raising his glass. "Proof that sometimes the best families are the ones we choose, not the ones we're born into." Sheriff Coleman, who'd been re-elected after his testimony against Marcus, added, "To courage in the face of power, and to the truth that always wins in the end." One by one, their neighbors stood to speak. Not elaborate speeches, but simple truths. How Jake had helped rebuild after a fire. How Rose had nursed a sick child through fever. How together they'd shown that love could bloom even in the harshest ground. As midnight approached and the celebration began to wind down, Rose found herself standing apart for a moment, watching the scene. Jake was dancing with little Anna Carlson, who stood on his boots as he moved. Thomas had fallen asleep in Mrs. Henderson's arms. Caroline was deep in conversation with Judge Harrison, who'd returned for the wedding. The Bailey boys were sneaking extra pieces of cake when they thought no one was looking. This was family. Not the cold, proper family of her Boston childhood, or the twisted mockery of family she'd experienced with the Thorntons. This was real messy, wonderful family bound together by choice and strengthened by trial. "Penny, for your thoughts." Jake appeared beside her, slipping an arm around her expanding waist. "I was thinking about Charlie," Rose said honestly, wondering if he'd be happy knowing his son was being raised with such love. "I think he would," Jake said. "Any man would be grateful knowing his child was safe and cherished." And Elizabeth. Despite everything, I think she would have been happy to see Marcus brought to justice. She helped make it happen. Her diary, her courage in writing it all down. Jake pressed a kiss to Rose's temple. They're both part of our story in their way. As the last guest departed with promises to help with the harvest and invitations to Sunday dinners, Jake and Rose stood on their porch, Thomas sleeping in Jake's arms. "Ready for what comes next?" Jake asked. Rose thought about the baby, soon to arrive, the ranch work that never ended, the challenges of raising children on the frontier, the uncertainties that every tomorrow brought. "With you, I'm ready for anything." They went inside their home, their true home, and settled Thomas in his crib. As Rose changed out of her wedding dress, she found the letter she'd been writing to send to newspapers back east, telling the true story of Marcus Thornton's crimes and the community that had stood against him. It was important, she felt, that people knew that justice could prevail even in the wild territories when good people stood together. But that was tomorrow's task. Tonight was for being grateful. For Jake, who'd saved her body and soul. For Thomas, who'd given her purpose when she'd had none. For the child growing within her, already loved and wanted. For the community that had become her fortress. As she climbed into bed beside her husband, Rose thought about that night in the blizzard when she'd been certain she would die alone and unmourned. How different reality had turned out to be. "Jake," she whispered in the darkness. Thank you for stopping that night, for hearing my cry." Jake pulled her close, mindful of her pregnant belly between them. "Thank you for crying out, for not giving up." Outside, the Montana night was peaceful. No storms, no threats, just the vast quiet of the frontier under stars. Inside the cabin, a family slept safe and whole and home. The Wild West was still wild, still dangerous, still demanding. But it was also a place where broken people could rebuild, where love could conquer fear, where a woman with nothing but determination and a man with nothing but loneliness could create everything that mattered. Their story would become legend in those parts, the tale of the cowboy who rescued a woman from the snow, only to discover she carried not just a child, but his entire future. The story would grow in the telling, as frontier stories do, but at its heart would always remain this truth. Sometimes salvation comes in unexpected forms, and sometimes the family we choose is stronger than the family we're born to. And in the Broken Arrow Ranch, where the mountains met the sky and the grass grew tall and strong, that chosen family thrived, proof that even in the harshest landscape, love could take root and flourish wild and free as the West itself.